you. Thank you. I'm going to hope that my sound is working tonight, and I can... It's very low, that, isn't it? Let's see if we can turn it up a little bit, and this can be a bit of background for my introduction. Some of you may be familiar with the Beatles. Hopefully you are. I'm going to be talking a little bit about them, and the Beatles have played quite a big part in my research recently. If this sound is interfering, just stick your hand up and say, turn the music off. It's a real privilege to be at Heriot-Watt University, and it's also a privilege and a great opportunity for me to have this evening to talk to you, indulge by telling you about some of my research, my interests in memory, language, music, and psychology. It's so good to have such a good audience here, and you're obviously here for a reason, and I hope that in half an hour or so you will feel more interested in memory and not less interested, and I hope I can persuade you that memory, in terms of our cognitive dynamics, our psychological dynamics, then memory is really the linchpin in what makes us human. That's my thesis, so I hope you'll find it interesting. So just briefly, I have some words for you to take a look at. Now, when I say there'll be a little bit of audience participation, you don't need to worry. You won't have to move from your seat or do anything embarrassing. But I might just ask you a couple of questions in the course of my talk tonight. I want you just to scan these words, have a think about them, and then we'll come back to them later on. And this may or may not tell us something interesting and revealing about the nature of human memory. So I'll give you, that's it, let's move on for just a brief moment to look at them. So what is memory then? Well, it might be easier for me to pose the question, what isn't memory? I'd like to know which of us today hasn't used memory in almost every step that we've taken. If you haven't said, I must remember to do that, you've certainly thought it. If you haven't recognized that you've forgotten something, I'd be very surprised. So memory is essential to our daily living. It's essential to what makes us human. Memory is multifaceted, and tonight I can only consider a really small proportion of that. I'll just tell you about some of the things that I'm interested in, and hopefully you will share some of the interest in them. So, memory is our earliest remembered experiences. We've done a little bit of research on that. My two kids at the back don't need to be embarrassed because this isn't you when you were babies, so that's okay. But memory is from our very earliest remembered experiences. Memory is how to tie your shoelaces. So, examples of procedural knowledge, how to drive a car, how to play the piano, how to get from A to B. Yes, and speaking of how to get from A to B, who can make sense of this? I have to say that this is really interesting for me as a psychologist. I'm not into spatial memory, but this map was of very little use to me a couple of months ago when I started here, because navigating inside the campus is completely different to navigating on the outside. So all these external reference points are not relevant when you're trying to get from John Moore to David Brewster or wherever it might be. So for a small university, this is quite a challenge, navigating around Heriot-Watt. But I'm pleased to say that my spatial memory has improved rapidly over the past few weeks, and I can almost work out what all of this means. So another way in which we use our memory on a minute-by-minute basis. What did you have for lunch last Thursday? Think about it. Who remembers what they had for lunch last Thursday? I can't remember, although I might, I'm asking the question, so I've had time to have a think about it. Fairly trivial, low-level knowledge. Now, why is this interesting to us? It's interesting to us because then, as Steve was saying, when we apply our understanding of memory in, say, forensic settings, when we're asking people to give as detailed accounts as possible of a recent event, possibly a traumatic event, witnessing a crime, or whatever it might be, then typically this is the kind of low-level, I would call it trivial knowledge, that we're looking for, that people are looking for in these sort of forensic settings, in police interviews, whatever. And one of the things that I've been interested in is as a memory expert, is looking at whether these sort of trivial details are really important and relevant if we're in a sort of witness situation where we've seen a crime take place. We might have been the victim of a crime. So, but that's the kind of knowledge that we think that people should remember if they're to be reliable witnesses for us. What's the capital of Venezuela? So I'm not going to ask anybody to put their hands up or embarrass themselves. A different form of knowledge. So this is what we call semantic knowledge. It's kind of learned information that you might acquire at school or later on. For any of us who are old enough to remember Gregory's Girl, then you should know the capital of Venezuela. I'm a sad Gregory's Girl fan, so I can immediately name the capital of Venezuela, but that's not because of my semantic knowledge so much that I'm a bit of a film geek. But all of these aspects of acquired knowledge. Now, this is a particularly interesting issue in memory, questioning what somebody's name is. You might have had the experience in the past week where you've walked down the corridor at Heriot-Watt and you've encountered some. I have it at the moment quite a lot because I'm new, I've been introduced to lots of people, and I encounter somebody whose face is familiar to me, but I can't put the name to it. So for all our modern technologies and smartphones and whatever, these are not going to help us with issues like this. You can't rely on anything but your genuine memory to remember somebody's name. So this famous character actor, you might know him as Sherlock, or he's done various things recently, misnamed in a recent Daily Mail report as Dominic Cumberbatch. In fact, his name is Benedict Cumberbatch. And so a very distinctive sort of character actor. But, you know, it might be difficult to get to his name. The name is unique. The characters he plays are slightly less unique. And that's one of the interesting sort of interfaces between faces and names. Faces and names have a unique combination together, and that makes them particularly difficult in memory type of situations. For those of you who are interested in Scottish politics, one of our famous Scots MPs, Nicola Sturgeon. And so again, what you might have here is a sense of familiarity. You might be able to tell me it's a politician, because there are lots of people who are politicians. So actually, to associate a face with a familiar category of person is relatively easy. To then get that next level through to their name is much more difficult, because that name is, as I say, usually fairly uniquely associated with that individual. So it's easy enough to tell me it's a politician, if you know Scottish politics at all. To get to the name is that next level, as I say. Again, a famous character actor, you might know him as Tony Blair or Brian Clough, but he's Martin Sheen. And again, you might have an experience of the sort of a tip of the tongue effect, what we call a tip of the tongue effect, where you can tell me the character he's played, you can tell me he's an actor. You might even be able to get the sort of what we call the prosody of his name, which is you might be able to tell me that it begins with an M and it goes malala. You know, it has a certain rhythm, the name. And so what that tells us about memory that's really interesting is that we have elements of memory that need to be pieced back together, that aren't always readily available in their complete form for us. If that name and face are well enough associated, we can get directly to it. Otherwise, we might struggle and we might get to a tip of the tongue situation. We ultimately will get the name or we won't get the name. So names are really interesting. Now, I have an interest in Scottish politics, and this is a famous female Scots politician who was in her prime when I was growing up in the Western Isles in the 1970s. And so that's Winnie Ewing from a great heritage of Scottish politics. Now, I have to confess that the last person I want you to identify, I didn't realise the constituency of this audience tonight. And so I didn't quite appreciate that this person might be here. but I thought we should all be able to name our principal. So all of these people's names, some of them should be more easily recognizable, identifiable, and nameable than others. So really interesting correspondence between memory, faces, and names. Who committed the crime? Okay, so if you have a line-up situation and you've witnessed a crime and you're asked to say who you think the perpetrator was. Now, I have a colleague in the audience somewhere, Chris, who's done a really interesting experiment with his students recently and actually staged a crime in a lecture. And the students were then asked to identify the criminal. Wasn't really a criminal, but they gave all variety of descriptions of this person. So some said he had a ponytail, some said he had bald hair, some said he was medium height, and others said he was tall, and whatever. So one of the things with witnessing a crime is that you tend to focus on certain elements of the crime and ignore others. So for example, if I'd witnessed a crime where somebody was carrying a gun, I would be very much less likely to be able to give you any details of what the person looked like, because all of my attentional focus is going on that weapon. So there are lots of things that happen in crime situations that might make you a more or less reliable witness. The other thing that happens once we get beyond the witness situation and we get into the lineup situation where you have to make an identification is that our memories and our cognitions, our beliefs are very easily manipulated by the questions we're asked, by the situation we're in. There's a good example I use with my students where you get a witness who says, oh, I really don't know, might have been number 4. And the policeman says, okay, number 4. Months later, in the courtroom, the witness is very confident that the perpetrator was number 4, simply because they've been given this kind of okay message. It's kind of fed into their uncertainty or relieved their uncertainty, and they quite confidently assert that the perpetrator is number 4. So one of the things we have to do as psychologists and memory experts is to advise in this kind of forensic situation so that we make sure that the witness is as balanced as possible, that their memory is as accurate as it possibly could be. And one of the things that I've come to understand is that memory accuracy does not equate to memory detail. So saying that, there's Chris who did that memory experiment with his students. So saying that a memory is detailed does not equate to it being accurate, reliable, believable. And that obviously is quite hard to square and difficult to make sense of. But an important role for those of us who are involved in memory and forensic psychology. Who am I? Now, this is why I think that memory is really interesting. So memory is interesting for all of these other reasons, and I'm pleased that I can tie my shoelaces and navigate around Heriot-Watt. But I think the really interesting thing about the sort of memory that I study is the fact that it helps us understand who we are. Not only helps us understand, it's not about facilitating. We would not have a sense of who we are if we did not have a memory of where we've come from, where we are in the present, and where we're going moving forward. So if I can't give you a history of myself, and now we've worked with patients who cannot give you a history of themselves because they've got amnesia, had stroke damage or whatever. What you find really, really interesting with these people is they will give you a sort of story-like account of their past that is simply like it's come out of what people have told them. It's not their own narrative about their lives. When they then try to work out who they are in the present, well, if I don't know what Catriona was doing last week and a year ago, it's kind of hard for me to work out where I need to be today, what I need to be doing. And also, if you ask me what's going to happen in a year's time, I'm not able to really build a good description of it. I can't plan for my future because I don't know who I am, because I don't have a past and I don't have a present. So this area of memory that I'm particularly interested in, autobiographical memory, gives that sense of self. Now, for a lot of psychologists, self is a kind of woolly concept, and I completely appreciate that because I come from a background in experimental psychology where everything was hard and fast and definite, and you did everything in the lab and you designed it all in and you cut out all the extraneous variables. What I like about moving into this line of research is that although it's less certain, it offers up so much more information about what humans are like, human memory, the human psyche, and whatever. So it comes with a penalty that we're in sort of difficult scientific territory, but it comes with a bonus that we're going to understand human beings at the end of the day very much better than we previously did. That's my thesis, and I'm happy to be challenged on it. Okay, so when I said a bit of audience participation, really not much, and there's no need to feel afraid, but what I would like you to do is to recall your earliest memory. Now, for some people, they can do that instantaneously. For other folks, might take you a couple of seconds, shouldn't take you very long. This is actually quite an easy memory task. I want you to have a think about that earliest memory. How old were you when that event occurred? What was the weather like when that event occurred? You may or may not remember that. What were you wearing? Now, these questions aren't random, and it goes back to what I was saying about the whole forensic element, is that because these are the sorts of questions that people get asked, and then judgments are made about the accuracy of their memories. Was it an emotional memory? Right, now what I'd like to do now, the small element of audience participation, is you've had time to have a think about when your earliest memory occurred. Can you put your hand up if the memory is from below the age of 5 years? And what I'd like you to do is just have a look around and scan and just see. Now, what I need you to do, don't be shy, keep your hands up. This is really important to me. Can you keep your hand up if the memory is from below the age of 4? Right, and you have a look and right, some of the hands have gone down. Can you keep your hand up if the memory is from below the age of 3? Interesting. Now, for those of you at the front, you might have seen what happened there. Some hands still up. Memory from below the age of 2. Right, no, kids, stop it. They're spoiling. they're spoiling my experiment because they know. Get your hands down. You know, right, but memory from below the age of 1. Right, about 1. Okay, that's a perfect demonstration of what we call infantile amnesia, that we don't have memories from very early childhood. And it works in every audience that you do it with, is that typically the hands go down between the ages of 4 and 3. So this is actually a very robust sort of phenomenon in autobiographical memory. So now, we can question, and I will in a minute, have a look at maybe there are some people who can remember their very early years. Maybe. That's possible. But generally speaking, as demonstrated here just now, we cannot remember our very early years. So why would that be? What is it in psychological terms? So this is the whole concept of autobiographical memory. Memory for our lives. It does what it says. It typically emerges around the age of 3.5, as we've seen here just now. Not everybody is the same, and I'm not saying that I disbelieve a memory if it's from the age of 2. I firmly believe I have a memory from about the age of 2, but I don't know. I don't know. But it typically emerges around the age of 3.5. So this term infantile amnesia, now this is nothing new. You won't be surprised to learn about it. I suppose we've all kind of thought about it. Freud, when he used to have his patients on the couch and interrogate them about their childhoods, recognised this concept and was the first to sort of label it, identify it. There's not much remembered from the age of below 5. There's very fragmentary memories from below the age of 5. And typically, what psychologists, as a rule of thumb, we think nobody can remember things from below the age of 1. Or can they? Actually, interestingly, we've got a very large database of early childhood memories, over 12,000. And there are several hundred that are below the age of 1. Now, as I say, this is into this kind of interesting territory for us as scientists, because I have to believe somebody when they tell me about their memory. I can say, well, actually, this is, some stuff must be fantasy and we can cut so much out. But if you give me what you believe to be an honest account of your earliest memory, generally speaking, I have to accept that and say, they're probably telling the truth, and there may be a bit of embellishment or, changes over the years or whatever. But we do generally hold to the view that people can't remember things from below the age of 1. Why don't we remember early childhood? So there are various levels of explanation for this. I'm not going to bore you with them. I'm going to cut straight to the chase. These are not competing explanations. These are explanations at different levels of analysis, as many of you will recognise. So it could be to do with the brain itself, could be to do with more general physical development, could be to do with more the cognitive architecture of having limited memory structures, or the one that I subscribe to is that it's to do with language development. So I think the reason that we suffer from this infantile amnesia may not be suffering, it may actually, there might be all kinds. Freud argued it was a very functional thing, that you wouldn't want to remember your very early memories for lots of reasons. But I came at this, I started out in language research and got in with a bunch of memory researchers, and we thought, what can we do with language and do with memory, and see if we can work together and do something useful with it and learn something. So my PhD and then my subsequent postdoc research was on language acquisition. And what we did with this was looking at early language and what that affords us in terms of our cognitive development and our cognitive behaviour across the lifespan. What we found was that the very early language that you learn is embedded psychologically to the extent that it is throughout your lifespan much faster in terms of reaction times and accuracy. The early language is core. And then when it comes to the point where you're bilingual, again, early language is really important. With people who suffer strokes or Alzheimer's disease, the early language is the stuff that stays, it's the stuff that remains. So there's something about what we take in our very early childhood that has a lifelong benefit for us. So early concepts are easier, reaction times, accuracy, survive damage better. We call this the first in, last out theory. So the first words in are the last words out, and it's very neatly demonstrated in studies of Alzheimer's disease. So then we thought, well, if we've got this, and this is quite well established, how could we use this in terms of understanding infantile amnesia? This is a paper we did in 2010, and I won't go into the details because it's not very interesting to drill down too far. But we got early words and early memories, and we had a look at the correspondence between them. So if we have a look at your language acquisition and the record of your earliest memories, to what extent do these match up? What we found, in fact, was a striking correlation whereby the words typically were in your vocabulary about 12 months before the earliest memories emerged. And what that tells us is that we think you acquire the language, you have some grounding with the language, you contextualize your early vocabulary, and then you're starting to be able to use it in a sort of narrative kind of way to describe events from your life. And what I believe is that until not just do you have the words, but you've got that narrative skill, you're not going to set down autobiographical memories. So the reason we think that memories emerge around the age of 3.5 is that this is the point in life at which children are able to tell stories about their lives. So of course children acquire language from the age of 12 months or so, but much before the age of 3, they're not able to string that language together actually to tell you a story. They're talking in very brief word utterances. So we think it's the emergence of autobiographical memory is to do with language, it's to do with telling stories. And then what we can do with that is we can look at it in forensic settings. And we can say, well, how believable are early memories? And what we believe is that memories that people relate to us from childhood, if they are told in a very elaborate language, they're less believable than if they're told in the language that we had available at what we call the time of encoding, when the events actually occurred. So we think that in order to set down stories about your life, you need to have that narrative structure in place. And we're not the only ones who think this. This experiment I really wish I'd done, but it's not my experiment. It's a colleague in New Zealand. This is called the magic shrinking machine. And what they do here is they give, you can see the toddler, he's got a ball, and he puts the ball in the top of the machine. And then he cranks the handle. Now, children at quite a young age have conservation of mass. So they understand that a big ball can't easily become a small ball. There's something funny going on there. So what they do is the kid uses a machine, cranks the handle, a big ball goes in the top, and a small ball comes out the bottom. And that's really interesting, because that's not right. And that, you know, the kid's going, oh. So he's paying attention to that, and he's thinking, I'm going to remember this. Well, I put a big ball in, and a small ball came out. What they did was with children of various, fairly young ages, from 18 months upwards, had a look at this, went back and tested them 6 and 12 months later. And what they found was that the children never described the event in any other language than that they had available to them at the time the original event occurred. So the children were only able to describe the magic shrinking machine in the language they had when they originally encountered it. So for me, a really powerful demonstration of the fact that the language needs to be there, needs to be in place if we're going to have memories that we're able later to articulate about events. So I really like this, partly because it's put very much more eloquently than I could. The reason I mention this is that this is a blog that appeared in the Huffington Post about 3 weeks ago. Psychologist and author Charles Fernyhough, who's at Durham. And what pleased us a lot was that he used our research as an example of the way that narrative is a temporal scaffold. I can't say it any better than he does. But so what he says is, narrative provides a temporal scaffold for putting the pieces of a memory back together. Some, in fact, have argued that acquiring the ability to do narrative, this is people like me, to do narrative allows young children to begin to tell stories about their pasts, explaining why, in early adulthood, our very early years are lost to us. So I think there's some quite, there are some very persuasive people behind this notion that language and memory are essentially intertwined. And you certainly can't have memory without having the language scaffolding. Some other authors, and two opposing views on memory, and you probably know already what I think, but here is a quote that goes, "Childhood is what anyone wants to remember of it. It leaves behind no fossils except perhaps in fiction." So that's Carol Shields in the Stone Diaries. Contrasting view from Hilary Mantel, who says, "Some people have tried to persuade me that my early memories are not authentic, but I believe strongly in the power and persistence of memory. In our brains, past and present coexist. They occupy, as it were, adjoining rooms, but there are some rooms we never enter. We seem to have lost the keys, but they can be retrieved." So two very different views. I will leave you to have your own opinions. My own experience of memory, and I'll talk about a couple more things that persuade me of the latter point of view. So I'm strongly a believer that there is very much more in there than is easily accessible. So we have a lot of stuff stored that we can't easily retrieve. And so one of the jobs as psychologists at this juncture is looking at the cues that we can use to tap memory and think of creative ways in which we can access memories that otherwise might be irretrievable. So that brings me on to some cues for autobiographical memory. We've already looked at language. I think that's really important for the development and also accessing memories. Psychologists are fairly, like myself, are fairly traditional creatures and like to sit in the lab and control things tightly and whatever. And what we're coming to realize is that there are ways of accessing a full range of memories that we really haven't considered very much up till now. And one really good one, I think, that is ignored is if you think about the scent of your mother's perfume. Now, you imagine that you were to get a waft of the perfume your mother wore when you were a child, and that floated past you right now. What would that do for you? It would definitely do something. It would definitely not keep you in this lecture theatre listening to me. You would definitely be distracted, and you might invoke scenes, you might invoke incidents with your mother, you might invoke other childhood events, all kinds of things. And I think smell is, as I say, a tool that we're not using enough as psychologists. Now, again, it's not us who's thought of this. Some of you will know Proust and his story about memory, where he is in Paris and he's walking through the streets of Paris and he walks past a patisserie. And out of the patisserie wafts a smell of Madeleine cakes. And he describes in very poetic terms the way that he is transported back to his grandmother's parlour when he smells those cakes. It's like a time tunnel, that he goes straight back to childhood and he's back in his grandmother's parlour and there he is like 60 years, not that much, but 40 years haven't passed. So he describes it really nicely. As I say, these authors have a way with words, don't they? But he says, when nothing else subsists from the past, after the people are dead, after the things are broken and scattered, the smell and taste of things remained poised a long time, like souls, bearing resiliently on tiny and almost impalpable drops of their essence, the immense edifice of memory. So, I'm not going to try and paraphrase that, but you get the sense of exactly how powerful this experience was for Proust and what the smell did in transporting him back and getting him to recover these memories that had been ignored for a while, if not forgotten. Well, we did this we thought we'll have a look at smell and memory, and we couldn't do it with a beautiful poetic Proustian way. But this is work that I did a few years ago when I was at Cardiff University. And so we were doing some work with people who we thought might be at risk of developing Alzheimer's disease for various genetic reasons, familial reasons, whatever. These people were at risk of dementia. Now, we had a huge battery of neuropsychological tests, everything you can imagine, every kind of language and memory and attention and all sorts. And we weren't really getting at it. And we thought, there's got to be something about this group of people that we can identify as being, somehow indicative that there's something maybe not quite right with their cognitive behavior. And right at that time, it was a lucky coincidence that some experiments were coming out, some papers were coming out on olfaction or smell and memory. So we thought, well, we'll include this really simple test of memory for smells in our massive big battery. And this was Olivia Handley's PhD. She spent 3 years on it. The one test that was successful was the olfactory test, in the sense that it discriminated this group of at-risk people. Their memory for smells was very much poorer than were the control groups. So what we never did was follow this work up. But there seems to be something interesting in the relationship between smell and memory that may be indicative of early indicators of cognitive decline when linked with genetics and familial risk and so on. And then there's music. So I'd like to play this for you, for those of you who are Elbow fans, and just listen to the words. See if I can get this going. Because I want you to think about the words. I really like the way this is put here. It makes a lot of sense to me in terms of the power that music has to take you to a place. So I don't know if you've ever had that sense. I'm sure some of us definitely have had the sense that, you know, here he is, he's dead busy, he's getting on with all of this stuff, and all of a sudden this song seeps into his consciousness, and he's transported. He's transported back to 3,000 miles away, five years ago. So it's that power of music that I think is really nicely expressed in a song like this. Well, we had the opportunity to do this a few years ago, and we teamed up with the ESRC, and it was the Liverpool Science Festival, and you know, what could be more opportune than that? Let's do some stuff on the Beatles. So we teamed up with the Beatles Museum, whatever it's called, and got a nice web company to design our website, and just asked people for their memories of the Beatles. Now, I'm not going to go into this in any detail. The one thing I'd want to point out, so we got over 5,000 memories of the Beatles. We said, what can you remember about the Beatles? What's your most salient memory? It could be buying an album. It could be going to a ballroom in 1963. It could be a personal encounter. It could be anything. Just tell us your most salient memory. And what we found was, from a memory perspective, we get this, again, a really sort of robust phenomenon in autobiographical memory, which is called the reminiscence bump. And what you can see is that if you look at memories across the lifespan, it's not doing it for me terribly well, but it's pretty obvious. If you look at memories across the lifespan, then the vast majority of the memories, it's not very clear to see here, but this is 11 to 15 years of age, 16 to 20. What we see is that the cluster of memories of the Beatles are around these formative years. Now, one of the reasons why this is interesting, and the only one that I'll bother you with, is it's back to this notion of a sense of self. When does somebody develop a sense of self? In their early teenage years. When is music important to them? In their early teenage years. So a really nice correspondence there, we think, between music and the emergence of a true sense of self. I'm going to, before I mention one of my favourite memories, just to say Paul McCartney uses the Beatles songs as memories too. Shea Stadium concert, I think, was 1967. This is an article from a couple of years ago on a website. This is the Beatles actually at Shea Stadium. Paul McCartney went back, and he said just this experience of being at Shea Stadium and singing the songs transported him back. And he describes it in very similar ways to the ones we've seen already about the way that music and other elements of memory can transport you back. This is my favourite memory. One of the reasons is because it's a memory from Leeds, where I was at the time that I was doing this research. But I think it's quite a charming memory, and I think it's very believable, but you make up your own mind. So she says, saving up for my first holiday abroad, I found a second job as an usherette at the Leeds Odeon. Together with the films, there were live concerts, including the Beatles in 1963. The manager, Mr. Clark, told us that once the tickets holders were seated, we could stand in the side aisles next to the stage. Clearly, we were delighted. At the interval, the manager came to me and said that George Harrison wanted me to go backstage after the show. Well, in my innocence, I had no idea about the possible outcomes of such an encounter. All I could think was that my boyfriend was in the audience, as well as which I could not risk the wrath of my mother if I wasn't on the last bus home. The strange thing is that I didn't get excited about it, tell friends. It's only now, when I reflect back, I wonder if I would have taken a chance had it been John. ... Fussy woman. I think if any of the Beatles had said they wanted me backstage, I'd have probably, I might have just forgotten about the last bus home. But so, you know, you get the sense there that I say this field of inquiry, we have to accept what people are saying, generally speaking, as being true. They've got some of these that were totally fantastical. But there's a judgment to be made. But I mean, I don't have any sense that this woman is making up this particular memory. But it's just interesting territory for us as scientists. I'm not going to take up too much longer. I just wanted to talk very briefly about some recent research that we've done as well. And so we've been interested in debunking memory myths, what we think we can remember about childhood, and the beliefs that we all have about memory. Again, back to this notion that we need to, as psychologists, be able to give expert advice in tricky situations where people are recalling events. So a paper that's just been published last month, what can we remember about childhood? So just back to what I was asking you earlier, we asked adults to remember childhood events of things like holidays or birthdays or whatever it might be. And to be as honest as possible. One of the issues is when you ask people about memory and you say, what was the weather like? They think, oh, I'm supposed to know what the weather was like because she's asking me. So we said to them, you don't remember anything you can't remember, and just give us as honest an account of these events as possible. In fact, people don't remember the weather, unless it's a holiday and they've been to Mallorca or wherever it might be. They don't remember what the weather was like on their 7th birthday. They don't remember the day of the week. Why should that be a problem? Well, the reason it should be a problem is because many of us, if we end up then in a jury situation and we say, oh, you know that, she couldn't remember what day of the week it was, you start to question, well, how much else does she remember that's accurate as well? You know, in fact, people just simply don't remember details like that. And they don't remember what they were wearing either. And so we got a job of work to do to persuade people in these sort of forensic situations that these are not reasonable, or they're not the right questions to be asking, at least, when we're judging memory accuracy. So then the other things we did, the other thing we've just done, and this is a paper in press now, so we asked people what they thought about memories. So again, you know, imagine you're in a jury situation. If somebody gives you a detailed memory, is it more likely to be true? Our respondents said yes. The psychological evidence says no. And hopefully I've persuaded you a bit of that already. More emotional memories are likely to be true, our respondents told us. Not always. Emotion actually affects memory in very complicated ways. It's not always true, sometimes true, but not always true that more emotional memories are likely to be real memories. Is it possible to remember very childhood events? The interesting thing with our respondents is they all said, you know, like we've just done here, I remember something from about the age of 3, but they were generally convinced that other people around them had earlier memories than they had. So they believed that people could remember events from very early childhood, even though their own memory is telling them that, you know, about 3 is when these memories emerge. So what we're trying to do with this is to, as I say, debunk some of these myths about memory and get a more realistic impression of what an accurate sort of autobiographical landscape might be. What might it be reasonable for a person to remember from events in their life? This one I put up very briefly. It's just because, again, this came to me recently because this is an account from a blog a couple of weeks ago from the Manchester Evening News where this very prominent child abuse cases of celebrities have come to light. And I mean, this is a fairly kind of straightforward, veridical account of what the witness is saying. I've put this in italics, but, you know, I'm interested in this sentence. The alleged victim says she buried the attacks for 47 years. And what she says here is interesting as well. I've not forgotten anything about the main events. Believe me, you do not remember small details. That's what our data is telling us. You remember the main details. But I just got the sense that this maybe is my interpretation of it, but I got the sense there was an element of skepticism about the notion that she could have recovered this memory after 47 years. So it's quite interesting what's happened recently in courtroom settings. Very last thing I want to mention before we go and get our canapes is super memory. So this is an article I published last year. So I just thought you might be interested in this because, you know, we all would like to have a better memory, wouldn't we? And I study memory because it's my own memory is absolutely hopeless. So I wrote this article last year for The Psychologist, and this is not an exhaustive list, but these are 3 primary sort of forms of super memory. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure I'd want any of them, it has to be said. So the first one, mnemonism, some of you will know what's called method of loci, which is, you know, if I give you a random list of objects to remember, if you imagine yourself walking around your house and placing a cabbage at the front door and placing a book on the kitchen table and whatever, you can then walk through that route again, and you're very much more likely to remember random objects like cabbage, book, rabbit, whatever random list of words I give you. I did some, just some media work with Joshua Foer a couple of years ago, and he wrote this book, Moonwalking with Einstein. He was just fascinated by the notion of super memory, trained himself up, and won the World Memory Championships. And he complained he's a completely ordinary individual. It's a very narrow form of super memory. He's gone back to being a sort of regular Joe now, or regular Joshua. But he's firmly of the belief that anybody can do this, you know, and that's remembering like whole packs of playing cards and that sort of thing. So you can do it if you put your mind to it. But it doesn't really help you. It doesn't help you remember where you put your keys. So the use of it might be limited. I'll skip over this because time is short. But Savant Syndrome, Derek Paravicini, fascinating autistic man with a huge talent for the piano. And so able basically to listen to a piece and then play it. No musical training, very narrow sort of cognitive abilities, but highly specialized sort of focus on musical talent. And then this one is an interesting form, not very many of these around, but this is called highly superior autobiographical memory. This is a small bunch of people who've been recently identified who are unable to forget. And they can remember, if you say, what did you have for lunch on the 7th of July, 1995? Then they'll be able to tell you what they had. They'll be able to tell you what the weather was like. There's 2 interesting cases that you can easily find on the internet. One is Aurelian Heyman, who seems to quite like his talent for remembering everything. And you can actually watch that on 4OD. On the other hand, we have this patient AJ, who says, most have called it a gift, but I call it a burden. I run my entire life through my head every day, and it drives me crazy. So these are people with seemingly remarkable memories for their lives, but you know, one person enjoys it, the other person finds it a real chore. The other thing that I'm going on to do now, and this is the nice thing of being at Heriot-Watt, is I now have the opportunity, coming from a Gaelic-speaking background myself, interested in culture, music, memory, landscape, so bringing all of these things in. So what's interesting for me being here is the sort of distinctiveness and identity that a place like Heriot-Watt has. And so I'm really hoping that I can use that with some of my Gaelic-speaking colleagues to look at memory in the broader context of what it means to be Scottish, what it means to be bilingual, and whatever, growing up in a certain place. So, which of the list of words did you see before? We're finished, we're nearly finished. I'll let you go in just a second. So, those words, anything familiar? Okay? Okay? Right, let's have a look. Let's see if we can get it. Come on. Fear was there. Desk was there. Shade was there. Stool. Cam was there. Pain was there. Chair, anger, and window weren't there. And the original list that you got was this list here. So you see what I've done here? Now this is what we call we're trying to induce false memories in you. And a small proportion, now we would give much larger word lists than this. And I realize, it's 6 o'clock now on Wednesday evening and we're all a bit jaded. But give people lots of these lists and basically we're priming. So if I give you sitting, stool, table, and then I give you chair, you're in that same what we call semantic space. And some people will say with some confidence that they remember that chair was there originally when in fact it wasn't. So this is back to this notion of, the reliability of memory and how much confidence we have in what we've seen. Psychologists can use really simple tasks like this to demonstrate that our memory is highly fallible and very much open to persuasion and influence. So I'll leave it there. My final remark is simply to say that I hope you agree with me that memory is the essence of what makes us human. Thank you.